Dr. Bart D. Ehrman, welcome back to mythVision. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad that you're here joining us again. You have an upcoming course, the Scribal Corruption of Scripture. Tease us with that. And then I have an anonymous supporter who absolutely loves what you do, your work. They're inspired by it. They've learned so much, and they've taught me a lot along the way, who's trying to get some questions asked. And so hopefully we can give them answers.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah. Well, the course is on November 11th. It's a Saturday. It's a 4-lecture course. Each lecture 50 to 60 minutes, with a large Q&A afterwards. It's called the Scribal Corruption of Scripture, and it's about this topic that people have gotten increasingly familiar with, about how copyists of the New Testament often changed the text they were copying, sometimes, a lot of times by accident, but sometimes on purpose, creating problems for us. Since we don't have the original copies of the New Testament, or even early copies of the originals, but only copies centuries later, how do we know what the authors wrote? How do we know how scribes changed the text? How do we know why they changed the text? How do we know anything about this? Like, you're reading the Bible, you want to know what the words were, and what if you don't know the words? And so it'll be that. It's related to a book I wrote years ago called Misquoting Jesus, but it's going to be covering a lot of information not in that book, and a lot of information probably that people generally haven't heard before.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and dive into these questions, just in case some might be a little more time consuming than others. And thank you to the anonymous ghost, I'll call you, who helps make this possible. Who were B.P. Grandf and A.S. Hunt, and what contributions did their archaeological discoveries make to New Testament scholarship? Hint for Derek, Oxyrhynchus papyri.
Yeah, right. Okay, here I am back in my PhD exams once more. Right. So Grandf and Hunt were two British archaeologists who, at the end of the 19th century, wanted to discover manuscripts from the ancient world. They were classical scholars, and they wanted to find ancient manuscripts. For many centuries, people didn't even think about trying to find old manuscripts. But after the Enlightenment, scholars got interested in works from antiquity that no longer survived. And so they started going through libraries and monasteries, places where there would be books, to find them. But then eventually somebody thought, well, why don't we try to find some archaeologically? And Grandf and Hunt did that. And they had this brilliant idea, which was, how do you find a book? They were thinking rightly that probably the sands of Egypt would be a good place to look, because the humidity in the sand is constant throughout the centuries, and so things don't have a variation of high humidity, low humidity. It's constant, so things get preserved there. So they say, okay, we're going to go to dig in Egypt, but where do you dig? You can't just go to the wilderness and start digging and hope you find a manuscript. And so they had the bright idea that you go to something that is a city that's been covered up, not been excavated, and you find the garbage dump. Because where are people going to throw away their used manuscripts when they get a new copy of something? Where do they throw the old one? They throw it in the garbage dump. So they go to this place, and it's called Oxyrhynchus. It's in Egypt, and they knew the city was underneath the sand, but they didn't. They found the garbage dump, and the first thing they find, the first manuscript they find this little scrap of paper, papyrus, and it has a saying of Jesus on it that was not found in the New Testament. This is the first thing. Oh my God. You talk about striking gold right at the outset. And they published it as an unknown saying of Jesus. And it turns out, so they found some manuscripts that had these unknown sayings on them. And it turns out, we found out about 50 years later, when they discovered the Nag Hammadi library, which has the Gospel of Thomas in it, they found that these fragments that Grandf and Hunt found were from the Gospel of Thomas. And so it went from there. They found thousands and thousands of documents there. Most of them not biblical, of course. There were things like land deeds and divorce certificates and book and sale slips and receipts. They found all sorts of stuff that immensely grew our knowledge of antiquity. They found so many thousands of these things. This is starting in the 1890s. That many of them have not been published yet. They keep coming out. They come out all the time, and so they found a number of things, including gospel fragments and various other things in this thing. And so they were hugely important. And so these are called the Oxyrhynchus papyri. So if somebody's interested in that, they can just look up online the Oxyrhynchus papyri, and they can see it.
I was wondering about the recent discovery, if that plays any role. How shocking, how interesting is that discovery to you? But
of the gospel fragment, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, well, another gospel fragment is turned up, and it is it's not like, just a copy of, Luke chapter 3. It's the kind of thing where it looks like it's not a very complete, it's just a fragment, but it's pretty clear that it involves things found in various gospels. And so we don't have enough of it to know exactly what it is, but it looks like one of these things, like other fragments that we have, like Papyrus Egerton 2, which is a collection of, in that case, it's a little bit longer. We've got 4 stories that are not in the same gospel in the New Testament. And the question is, are these authors who are like coming up with these gospels that seem to be combinations of things, are they using the other gospels? Have they heard a bunch of stories that also made it into the other gospels? How are they getting this combination, and are they making up their own stuff? And so these is part of the interesting things of archaeological discoveries of manuscripts.
Thank you so much. What was harem? A practice employed, allegedly, by ancient Hebrews to justify the extermination of enemies by killing everyone, with the possible exception of young female virgins. Does this not reflect badly on the alleged moral superiority of Yahweh, since he commanded it?
So harem is is a practice that in war, if you in some cases you destroy everything connected with the enemy, and you don't keep anything for yourself. And so in the book of Joshua, there'll be cases where an Israelite soldier will kind of keep a souvenir or something, and when they find out, they kill him. They execute him because he's broken this thing. Because the idea is that Israel is to be distinct from all the other peoples that they're conquering, and so you're not allowed to, in these cases of harem, you're not allowed to keep them. And so there are some very ugly incidents in the Hebrew Bible. Today in one of my classes, I was talking about the destruction of the city of Jericho, according to Joshua chapter 6, where everything was to be destroyed. And so they killed every man, woman, and child in the city. They didn't take any of the women as sex slaves, as they do in other places in the Hebrew Bible, but they did they killed everybody, including the children and all the animals, and they weren't allowed to take any souvenirs. And so it's a complete destruction. Everything is dedicated to God as a destruction. And so that was practiced sometimes. Does that call Yahweh's moral integrity into question? Well, I would say for most of us don't think that the divine being overall, if such a being exists, probably is interested in killing innocent citizens and babies. I mean, so, but in Israel, this was according to the book of Joshua, this was an occasional practice that they did that, because the fear was that if you don't kill the children, that they'll grow up and they'll foster a rebellion later. So you kill them all. It didn't actually happen. I mean, these are stories, but they're not sort of uplifting stories. Even though when I was in Sunday school, we sang, about the Battle of Jericho, where the walls come tumbling down. We didn't read what happened next in the story, which is not good.
I know exactly what you're talking about. Thank you for answering that. What is your opinion regarding the authenticity of Matthew 16:17 through 19? Where Jesus chooses Peter to be the leader of the church? It would be something a scribe would have added to support the claims of the proto-Orthodox church. Would Jesus have thought at that time he was beginning a church? The content of these verses have been a bone of contention between Protestants and Catholic regarding the doctrine of papal supremacy. Does the peros, Petra, wordplay found in the Greek word in Aramaic, the language both would have spoken? Interestingly, it was James. Sorry, that was a question mark after both would have spoken. Interestingly, it was James rather than Peter who was elected head of the Jerusalem church after Jesus' departure. I hope that's something
Yeah. No, that's
okay.
A lot. One of my professors in graduate school, one of the most brilliant people I've ever known, one of the most erudite, learned people I know, named Carl Fried Froelich, wrote his PhD dissertation on this in Germany, on this passage. And so it's a very, very important passage. It's the passage where Jesus asks his disciples, who do people say that I am? And some of them say, well, some people say you're John the Baptist come back from the dead, or maybe you're Elijah, or one of the prophets. And Jesus says, well, who do you say that I am? And then Peter replies, you are the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus blesses Peter, and he says his name at the point was his actual name is Simon. He blesses Simon, and he says, "Your name shall be called Petros, because on this Petra I will build my church." And so Petros is a Petros so it's the Greek word, and the word Petros in Greek means a rock, like a stone. And he says, upon this Petra, which ends with an A instead of an OS, Petra, upon this Petra, I will build my church. Now, a Petra isn't like a stone that you pick up in your hand. A Petra is more like the big, massive stone on a cliff face. And so it could be a foundation stone. And so he says, upon this Petra, I will build my church. This was a huge source of debate during the Protestant Reformation, and continues to be among some Protestant and Catholics about what Jesus means. Because he says, you'll be called Petros, because upon this Petra, I will build my church. And in the Catholic interpretation that's come down all the way for centuries and centuries is Peter is the one upon whom Christ will build the church. And that is a play on words. You're Petros, I'll build the church on the Petra. So Peter, the first pope, is the Bishop of Rome. The first pope is the beginning of the church, and everything's built on Peter. That's the Catholic interpretation. Protestants in the 16th century started objecting to that view by pointing out, for one thing, they didn't think that Peter was the first pope that everything's built on the Catholic Church. But also they pointed out, just in terms of the interpretation of the passage, that Jesus says, you are Petros, and upon this Petra, I will build my church. It's not the same word. And Protestants have frequently argued that the Petra, the foundation stone for the church, is not the man Peter, but the confession that he made. You are the Messiah, the Son of God. It's that confession that is the Petra, and he's called Petros because he made the Petra. And so it's a play on words. And so that's the debate. So the initial question that this person was asking was, is it authentic? And I think the questioner gave us two options. That is it authentic, or was it added by scribes? And my answer is neither. I certainly don't think that Jesus historically said that, for the reasons that the questioner pointed out, that the idea that Jesus was going to build a church, in other words, that when he died, the Christian church was going to emerge, I don't think that that's something that Jesus himself talked about during his ministry. It's something that happened after his death. When his followers came to believe he got raised from the dead, they started their own community, and that grew and grew and grew and became the Christian church. Then later they said this was all planned by Jesus. But I don't think in Jesus' ministry he said that. This line about upon this rock I'll build my church is found only in Matthew. Matthew's getting the story from Mark, who doesn't say anything like that, and it's not found in the other Gospels. And so I think this is Matthew's way of doing it years later. It's not something Jesus said. So I don't think it's authentic, but I also don't think it's something added by later scribes. It's in all of our manuscripts of Matthew. There's no question about its authenticity to Matthew. So it's not authentic, but it wasn't added by scribes. It was put in there by Matthew. or by somebody in Matthew's community. This is what Matthew himself thought, either that he came up with it in his own head, or it was the kind of thing being said in his Christian community.
So just to put the ribbon on that present there that you built for us, as far as the interpretation of what it meant in its context from your academic background, instead of the tit for tat Protestant versus Catholic interpretation, what do you think, or what have the scholars that you're convinced make the most sense of this was intended here?
I think it's very difficult to say. This variation between Petros, Petros, and Petra, A, is very interesting. I don't think that we can say that it can't be like something in Matthew. It's like I don't think we can say, well, it cannot be very early because, in fact, James was the leader of the church. We don't know how James eventually became the leader of the church. We don't know if it was an election. I doubt it. I think James probably rose to prominence because he was the brother of Jesus, and so he's got a blood linkage there, and so he became more important. But according to, in the New Testament itself at least, Peter is the first to be the leader of the church. He's in the New Testament, he's portrayed as the closest disciple to Jesus, and so it would make sense that after Jesus' death, he would initially be the leader. There's pretty good evidence to suggest that Peter claimed he saw Jesus after his death, whether he actually had a vision of some kind or he saw something or whatever. But it's pretty clear that he was, if not the first, one of the first to claim he had seen Jesus alive afterwards. And since he had been the chief disciple, he became the leader of the group after Jesus' death. And then it wasn't long before James came in. James, according to the New Testament, was not a follower of Jesus during his life, and so he would not have been the leader immediately after his death, because it was only later. According to Paul, James had a vision of Jesus too. I don't know how or what that happened or what it was. So what's going on with this Peter thing? I think that Peter probably was the first founder, was the first leader of the church, and I suspect what's going on is that somebody's trying to explain why Petros is the leader of the church, and this saying gets devised in order to explain why Peter is the leader of the church. But the thing is, if you're doing this in Greek, this appears to be a Greek formulation. You can't say you are Petros, and on this Petros I will build this church, because a Petros is a stone that you pick up in your hand. You can't build a church on a stone. You need a foundation, and the foundation is called Petra. But he couldn't have called Peter Petra because Petra is feminine, and so to make the wordplay work, you've got to have the foundation stone be feminine, but the man be masculine. And so there was no option. I think it's playing on the words, but it's not meant to be. It was never meant to be that Petros is Petra, because that doesn't work because of the masculine feminine thing.
Thank you so much. This kind of ties into this idea about James. What is your opinion regarding the despoini, despocini, something like this, DESPOSYNI, the term given to the blood relatives of Jesus in the Jerusalem church? After the death of Jesus' brother James in the 60s, the leadership passed to Simeon, Jesus' cousin, brother, ? According to tradition, do you think the family of Jesus were considering establishing a dynasty, a plan disrupted by the Jewish War of 66 to 70? It would have been better than returning to subsistence living in Galilee. Either way, you get the idea.
Right. So the question is, so in the New Testament, Jesus has brothers. This is something denied in the Catholic tradition, as you know. But the Gospels are pretty clear that Jesus has brothers: James, Jude, Simon, and it's Joseph. It's a kind of a short form of Joseph. So you have those four brothers, and you've got a number of sisters and things, and so the idea is that after Jesus Jesus' death, James becomes one, and then after that Simon, and then you have this lineage. And the question is, was there an attempt at a dynasty? I don't know. Our sources of information are not very, very good about this. If I'm remembering correctly, a lot of this information comes from Hegesippus, we don't have his writings, but he's quoted by Eusebius. Hegesippus would be a 2nd century church father. Eusebius is an early 4th century church father who writes the church history, where he quotes a lot of earlier figures. And Eusebius in places does talk about the brothers of Jesus and their lineage. I don't think we know what happened to the Jerusalem church. According to one tradition, when Jesus' descendants are basically ruling this church for a while, and according to this tradition, when the Jewish uprising happened, the Christian church had a revelation that they had to get out of Jerusalem or they'd be killed, and they fled to Pella. And they kind of relocated there. I don't know if that's true or not. The stories we have of Jesus' descendants, I don't think can be verified. They can't really be disverified, but there's not a lot going for them, I think. I mean, another very famous story actually is told by Eusebius about the Emperor Domitian, who was concerned about the brothers of Jesus and what they were doing, and he found out that Jude, Jesus' brother, had descendants, and he brought them in because he was worried they'd start up a riot or something, and Christians were going to take over the world or whatever. But he brought them in, and they showed them their hands. Their hands were all calloused because they were farm workers, and he realized, man, they're not going to be a problem. They're not going to rouse an army, and so you get these stories. My point is, you get these stories, and I don't think that we can credit very many of them. I think the only thing we really know is that it does appear that James, the brother of Jesus, became a leader of the church in Jerusalem.
That kind of answers the next question, like, what are your thoughts on what happened to the Jerusalem church following the end of the Jewish War in 70? Did it linger on for centuries on the fringes of the Eastern Roman Empire before passing from the scene? Your answer is, you don't know.
I don't know. I don't think we really know. I think, Jerusalem for a long time, especially after 135. So for people who don't know how this works, the first Jewish uprising was in 66 and lasted till the year 73 with the fall of Masada, when the Romans wiped out the opposition. But then there was a second uprising in the year 132, so about 100 years after Jesus' death. There's another uprising, a revolt led by a figure named Bar Kokhba, and that's called the Bar Kokhba revolt. That again, the Romans wiped them out and it was in the year 135. And at that point, Jews were forbidden to enter into Jerusalem, and so they converted Jerusalem into a pagan city, Aelia Capitolina, and built a pagan temple on the mount, the Temple Mount, and the temple had been destroyed for a long time. And so after that point, there weren't Jews allowed in Jerusalem, and there wasn't really much of a Christian presence until the 4th century. And so there's no recollection later of much of a Christian presence there. And it really isn't until the beginning of the 4th century when there begins to be a cult to Stephen, the first martyr, that arises in Jerusalem. And then Jerusalem started becoming another point of attraction for Christians when they started thinking about it. It is the place Jesus died and the place where Stephen died. And then it started becoming an important Christian place again, but for hundreds of years it hadn't been.
Thank you for that. When do you believe a first version of the New Testament may have been compiled by the Proto-Orthodox Church, even if it differs from the one we have now? Scholar David Trobitz, in his book, The First Edition of the New Testament, has advanced the argument it may have been early as the second half of the 2nd century, perhaps somewhere in Asia Minor, as a response to the version produced by Marcion in the 140s.
So David Trobisch is a well-read and learned scholar. I think his book is completely wrong, and I think that the evidence that he adduces for his view simply does not work. I think it's not difficult to show why the evidence he adduces is it just doesn't work. Marcion is the first figure that we know about who compiled something like a collection of Christian scriptures. There may have been people earlier than him, but we don't know. Marcion is this figure who is a teacher who had a particular view of Christianity that he said was inspired by the Apostle Paul, that maintained that the God of the Old Testament was literally a different God from the God of Jesus, that there are two gods, and that the God of Jesus was a God of love who is trying to save people from the God of wrath, the God of the Old Testament. Marcion believed that's what Paul taught, and so he collected a group of books that supported this view. His collection of Christian books excluded the Old Testament altogether, because that was the book of the Jewish God, the God of wrath. It included 10 letters of Paul and a gospel that was very much like our Gospel of Luke. And so that was his collection of scriptures. And the argument many people have made is that the proto-Orthodox Christians responded to that by expanding his gospel collection into 4 gospels and expanding his Pauline collection into 13 letters plus letters by Peter and by James and by John and so forth. And so the idea is that the Orthodox collection that we ended up with is in some part a response to Marcion. That may be right, but I think that's completely overly simplified. We don't know when there was a circulation of proto-Orthodox books. What we can say is that there were collections of books. People certainly had collections of Paul's letters already by the end of the first century. And it kind of makes sense. It doesn't mean that they're collecting the New Testament, but if you want to know what Paul said, because he's important to you, then you get as many letters of his as you can. People collected gospels. We know this because we have gospel manuscripts that have more than one gospel in them from around the year 200. And so the people are collecting books. When did somebody start collecting them and saying these are the authoritative texts? We don't have the evidence to say one way or the other. I think there's no way it was happening at the end of the 2nd century. The evidence against that is so overwhelming that I think there's no way. As many people will know, the first time we have our collection, where you get the 27 books, and only those 27 books, the first time anybody comes up with that is in the year 367 in a letter by the Bishop of Alexandria, Athanasius. But at that point, he's saying what he thinks the correct collection is. We know of collections already by the 180s, but they're not definitive collections. They're like, it's not like the Proto-Orthodox collection. It's there were lots of Proto-Orthodox Christians who had lots of views of these things, and so
I hear that a lot, by the way, from a lot of apologists online. If they can prove early on that people used certain books, they somehow will try to make this argument that these are the ones, and we already know this goes all the way back, those kind of things.
Well, you could say that, but the problem is you've got authors into the 3rd and 4th century who are saying that those books are not inspired, they're not scriptural, they're not authoritative. I mean, in the person I wrote my PhD dissertation on, Didymus the Blind, who was living in the middle of the 4th century, said that 2 Peter is a forgery. So, I mean, it's true that some people might be saying it's canon, but other people saying it's not canon. So it completely depends on what you mean. When you say when is their first canon, I mean, it depends what you mean by canon. There were, of course, most Christians probably who were reading had books that they thought were authoritative, but that doesn't mean that there's something like a recognized canon. And even when Athanasius came up with his canon, his 27 books, there were other Christians who still thought, well, actually the Apocalypse of Peter ought to be in there. Or, the book of Hebrews really does not belong in there. And so there were debates that went on. And it wasn't, we're so used to thinking of a canon because when we go to the bookstore, we buy a New Testament. It's always the same 27 books. Pick your translation. And it just wasn't that way in Christianity for hundreds of years.
Thank you. What is the earliest extant manuscript of the Latin New Testament, Vulgate, based on Jerome's translation? When is it dated? Does the Latin translation vary greatly in context from the Greek? No, vary in content from the Greek.
I don't know when the oldest Vulgate manuscript is. I just don't know. The Vulgate does differ in many ways from the Greek New Testament. It's not clear whether Jerome translated the entire Latin Bible into Latin. The situation is a little bit complicated. There were Latin versions of the New Testament and before Jerome. So much so that Pope Damasus is the one who asked Jerome to make a more or less official translation. The problem was there were so many translations that all of them were different from each other, and they wanted to have a kind of a standardized edition. And so Jerome apparently did do the translation of the Gospels, but it's not clear at all that he did the rest of the New Testament. It was probably followers of Jerome that did other books. So Jerome, so probably sometime in the early 5th century is when we start getting these. But we have Latin manuscripts that are they are translations done before Jerome. And for those who are interested in what the oldest form of the New Testament was, those old Latin manuscripts, as they're called, are more important than the Vulgate done by Jerome and his successors. There are things. For example, this passage that affirms the Trinity, that there are three in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Spirit, and these three are one. That is found in the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, even though it's not in the early Greek manuscripts. And so that's something to think. Maybe it came into the New Testament from Latin sources, for example. But even when we say the Vulgate, there are different manuscripts of the Vulgate. There are many, many thousand manuscripts of the Vulgate. There are far more manuscripts of the Vulgate, Latin Vulgate, than there are of the Greek New Testament. And these differ from each other, so that there are different standard editions of the Vulgate. These are not hugely different from each other, but they do differ from each other. And so we don't even have the Vulgate per se.
Thank you so much. When it comes to Luke and Acts, do you favor the Western or Alexandrian texts, and why? Why the differences? On a related note, do you have an opinion on whether Tatian's lost diatessaron included the long version of Mark 16 verses 9 through 20, based on the available surviving evidence?
Well, so these are two different questions.
Right.
So to unpack that a little bit, the Book of Acts circulated in two different forms. One of them is 7.5% longer than the other, more words, and so a few extra verses here and there. And so the question is about what's called the Alexandrian text and the Western text. The Alexandrian text is so how to explain this? When we look at Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, since the 18th century, scholars have recognized that a lot of manuscripts have a lot of similarities to one another whenever there are differences among the manuscripts. And so suppose you've got a verse, and some manuscripts read it one way, and some have a different wording, either a slightly different wording or major different wording, or maybe some manuscripts have it, some manuscripts don't have it, something like that. When you look at enough manuscripts, after a while, you realize that some manuscripts typically agree with each other a lot, and other manuscripts typically agree with each other a lot. And so scholars came up with the idea in the 17th century of grouping manuscripts according to their similarities in places where they differ, where there were manuscript differences. Mm-hmm. And so these became textual families. And eventually they came to be called text types of text. The Alexandrian type of text is a form. It's a group of manuscripts that scholars arrange together because they agree with each other so often. Whenever there are differences among manuscripts, these tend to agree a lot, and they're called Alexandrian because it appears that this form of the text, these manuscripts seem to appear to descend from manuscripts that originated in Alexandria, Egypt. Okay, Western text manuscripts have, when there are differences, they tend to disagree with the Alexandrian manuscripts, but they agree with each other. And they're called Western, which is a bit of a misnomer because they actually can't be located necessarily to Western Christendom. But when people came up with these designations, they thought that these were manuscripts, for example, that were connected with Rome or someplace in the West. So, with all that said, the Book of Acts is found differently in the Alexandrian manuscripts than in these Western manuscripts. And it's a big difference, 7.5% difference. And so the question is, which one is the original form or the most original form? Most scholars would agree that what we call the Alexandrian text is the most original form for the Book of Acts. The question is, how do you get this Western form? And there have been a lot of interesting theories about that. One interesting theory is that Luke, the author, whoever he really was, we call Luke, that the author himself produced two versions of Acts. That he produced the Alexandrian version, say that's the first one, then later he decided to expand it a bit, and that became the Western version. Or the Alexandrian version was in circulation, and some scribe or some other person decided to make a new edition of it that expanded it significantly. So that would account for the Western manuscripts. So there are lots of theories that have gone over the years, and people have these debates. There are entire books written on this. I ain't going to solve it here, but most scholars agree that the Alexandrian text is probably the older form of the text.
Thank you. And then I think it was the idea about whether Tatian's Diatessaron included a long version of Mark 16:9 through 20 based on the available surviving evidence.
Well, I doubt it. So just to back up on that one, so the Diatessaron is the name of a form of the Gospels produced by the mid-2nd century Syrian church father Tatian. Tatian was a intellectual in the middle of the 2nd century who was from Syria, but he went to Rome to study with Justin, later known as Justin Martyr. Martyr is not his last name. He ended up being martyred, and so they call him Justin Martyr, who was a very prominent Christian intellectual in the middle of the 2nd century. Tatian went to study with Justin. And after Justin died, Tatian produced an edition of the Gospels that took the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and put them together into one consolidated edition. It's called the Diatessaron because the dia means through, and tesseron means four. So through the four. And so people call this the Diatessaron. And what he would do is if you have the same story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you conflate them. And so you get a bigger story where all the details in Mark and all the details in Matthew, the details in Luke are all put together. Or if the same story is in John, you throw that one in and you come up with a larger version of that story. And the stories each one has of its own are all put in the gospel. And so all the stories and all the gospels are together, and the ones that they share are kind of smashed together into a larger version of it. This would have been produced in the middle of the 2nd century, early second half of the 2nd century, and it no longer survives. And it is very, very difficult to figure out what was in it and what wasn't in it. It was obviously a huge book, but since we don't have it, reconstructing it is arguably the biggest headache of New Testament studies. People people I know, I have friends who have devoted their lives to trying to figure out what was in the Diatessaron, and boy, is it complicated because of the kind of evidence they have to look at, and so I don't know, but I don't think it was there, but I don't think we can say.
Thank you. Rather than the four Gospels, the Codex Fuldensis contains a Diatessaron. Although you mentioned in an earlier Q&A that the one compiled by Tatian has not survived, do you believe the version found in Fuldensis may be modeled on this lost text?
So Fuldensis is a Latin manuscript that has a gospel harmony. And a gospel harmony is when you take the four Gospels and you put them together into a fuller text. And some people have thought the Fuldensis is closely related to the Diatessaron. Some people have claimed it is the Diatessaron, which seems unlikely, very unlikely. So was it inspired by the Diatessaron? It's possible, but the idea of putting the Gospels together did not originate with Tatian. There are gospel harmonies before Tatian's. Two examples. One is it appears that Justin Martyr, his teacher, may have had a gospel harmony based on an analysis of his quotations of the Gospels. It may be that he himself is working from a harmony. And there's an earlier account. The Gospel of the Ebionites, not a well-known book, is we have only fragments of it in quotations from a church father, Epiphanius, and a 4th century church father, but it appears to be an early gospel. And in one of his quotations, it's quite clear that it's a gospel harmony. And it's a pretty interesting case because in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you have Jesus being baptized. So if you just read the individual Gospels, Jesus gets baptized, but the voice that comes from heaven at his baptism says different things in the 3 Gospels. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus gets baptized and the voice comes from heaven and says, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." In Matthew, the voice comes from heaven and it says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." So in Mark, it's speaking to Jesus, and in Matthew, it's speaking either to John the Baptist or the crowds, not to Jesus. But then when you get to Luke, it looks like the oldest version of Luke. This would be something I'm going to be talking about in my course on scriptural corruption. I'm probably going to talk about this verse. It looks like in Luke's gospel, the oldest reading appears to be the voice says, instead of saying this or "You are my son, my beloved Son, whom I will please," it says, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." Whoa. Jesus became the Son of God at the baptism? What? But that looks like it's the oldest reading. In the Gospel of the Ebionites that Epiphanius quotes, how does he, if you're going to combine the Gospels into one Gospel, what do you do with the fact that the voice says 3 different things? Well, what the Gospel of the Ebionites did is it said that the voice came 3 times. First, Jesus is baptized, and God says, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." The second time, the voice then speaks to the crowd, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." And then the third time, John the Baptist says, "Well, who is this guy? This you are my son. Today I have begotten you." It's like, what? And so it comes 3 times, and so that's a gospel harmony. And so that's probably before Tatian, I think. And so, yeah. So Fuldensis isn't necessarily dependent on Tatian, is the short answer.
It's really funny to see how far back harmonizing took place. It's right there out the gate. Yeah. Who was Mani and the religion he founded? Did his doctrines have any impact on early Christianity?
So Mani was you've heard of Manichaeism. Mm-hmm. Mani is the guy who started Manichaeism. Manichaeism was a religion that was very similar in many ways to Christianity. It had a large following. St. Augustine, before he became the Orthodox theologian he was a Manichaean. Mani was a prophet figure who declared that he was a divine being, a son of God, and produced writings. The basic idea in the Manichaean religion is that the world is completely dualistic, and that there are forces of good and evil that are doing battle with one another. It sounds kind of like Jewish apocalyptic thought, but it's more of an eternal struggle within Manichaeism, and so everything is light or darkness. It's falsehood or truth, and people side with one side or the other. And so this was an important religion that probably starts out. It becomes an important religion in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries. And started by this person Mani, who, unlike other sons of God, actually wrote down his views, and so he had a large following.
And I suspect, obviously, he pointed out some of his doctrines, but he probably had a major impact in many ways. Do you think that that impact trickled into and remained in certain versions of Christianity as time went by?
It's not clear to me that they did. The dualism has long been a feature of Christianity, where we think of the devil and God on opposite sides, the demons and the angels, and you think of truth and falsehood, and you think of heaven and hell and all of these things. And most of that could be picked up from non-Manichaean sources. I think a lot of Christian theology was being formulated independently of Manichaeism, but the dualism still, I think, is attractive to people, because I think for some reason people, at least in our world, tend to think in dualistic terms.
Thank you, Dr. Ehrman. What is the Book of Jubilees?
Right. So Jubilees is a Jewish writing. It's not in the Hebrew Bible, and it's not one of the Apocrypha. It's usually designated as a pseudepigraphon. So it's a pseudepigraphic work. It's not part of the Roman Catholic canon, let alone the Protestant canon. It actually is considered canonical in the Ethiopic Church as one of the scriptural books, and also among Ethiopic Jews. It's a 50 chapter book that claims to be a revelation from God to Moses, and so it's a book of kind of like a book of laws, explaining parts of Genesis. Sometimes it's called the smaller or the lesser Genesis. And so it was a book that was pretty much on the margins of consideration, except in Ethiopia, till the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was a book that was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so scholars' interest in the book was reignited with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there's been a lot of scholarship on it. So the basic answer is it's a Jewish book allegedly by Moses that is not accepted as canonical.
What's interesting about this book, just given a little tease of my conversation with Dead Sea Scroll scholar Matthew Munger, is he pointed out that it's evidence that there was no like solid, firm, this is the canon, that they're still kind of molding and adapting ideas and stuff. And it's a rewrite of Genesis in a way, is what he said. So it was just really interesting, like, to add to what you're saying, how they did that. It's fascinating.
Well, no, that's right. But it is evidence of that. And, there's other evidence of that. That's kind of the point of the Dead Sea Scrolls in some ways, is that, that people look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and evangelical apologists say, this proves, that X, Y, and Z, it proves, there's a canon of scripture or something. It proves this, that, or the other thing. And in fact, you have all these books among the Dead Sea Scrolls, including like First Enoch, which is hugely important among Jews in that community. And Jubilees is another one. It's a book that's hugely important in that community and is accepted as authoritative. And so the idea that you have this kind of canon by the time of Jesus that all Jews agree on is simply not true. And that's one of the virtues of the Dead Sea Scrolls for us as scholars today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You keep telling us about the Scribal Corruption. This course we opened up to this whole session with. Again, what are we looking at here, Dr. Ehrman? Well,
we're looking at a 4-lecture course. It's dealing with this kind of issue about how scribes were copying their texts changed them. And it's not going to be just the fact that they changed them. I think a lot of people know that. And a lot of people may know that we don't have the originals and we don't have, the first copies of the originals, and they know things have been changed. But in this course, I'm going to go much deeper and to talk about things like how do you go about analyzing a text? How do you know what the author wrote? And why don't you have more examples of this in the English Bibles that we buy? Why is it that you have these really important changes that change the meaning of an entire passage and you don't even get a footnote about it? Mm-hmm. And I'm going to be talking about places where that happens, where there's a good deal of uncertainty, including about passages that people are very familiar with, where scholars debate what they mean. And one point I'll make is, a lot of people who have opposed me, evangelical Christians, have insisted, no, we have so many manuscripts of the Bible that of course we can know what it originally said. And I'm going to show why it's just not true and why they will agree with me. They will agree with me. The reason they'll agree with me is because they know that they're scholars of the New Testament, and they know they disagree with some of their friends who are also evangelicals about what this verse originally said. So if we can know, why don't they agree?
Oh, I cannot wait. Everybody go sign up. I can't wait to see you there. Dr. Ehrman, it's always a pleasure to interview with you, and you're always a blast. So thank you for your time.
Okay. Well, thank you. This has been fun.
You as well.